Serial domestic abusers, spouses, boyfriends, partners, convicted multiple times of violently hitting, kicking, even choking a loved one. But many get out of prison before serving their full sentence. KSLA News 12 Chief Investigative Reporter Stacey Cameron recently exposed the loophole in Louisiana law allowing this to happen. Tonight, lawmakers agree to work with KSLA to close this loophole, and it could save lives. Our update in Stacey's ongoing series, A Crime of Violence.
Any bill that's ever filed and passed is never perfect.
Outside the state capitol in Baton Rouge.
The legislative process is a long one.
And inside these limestone walls.
Without objection.
A push to change Louisiana law, adding new protections for victims of domestic abuse.
And ultimately save lives.
Is taking hold in the House of Representatives. Speaking to Mariah Winiski, a domestic violence advocate in November.
You've got purse snatching on that list. You've got carjacking on that list. And yet you can strangle your wife and not be included on that list.
My original investigation exposed violent felons convicted of domestic assault battery qualify for early release from prison, some even getting lighter sentences because Louisiana law does not classify domestic assault battery as a crime of violence unless the victim is set on fire and seriously injured.
We rank third in the nation for the rate of women who are murdered by men, and of course the large majority of those are domestic violence homicides.
Disturbed by that disclosure.
Reporting that KSLA did that brought this issue to my attention and some other members of the legislature.
State lawmakers like Representative Cedric Glover of Shreveport and Representative Pat Smith from Baton Rouge are now spearheading a fight.
That's by amending the statutes that were put in place and making sure that we close those loopholes and ultimately save lives.
By adding felony domestic abuse battery to the crimes of violence list.
We know that domestic abuse battery, just by its definition, includes the term violence and being violent, but it's not considered for sentencing purposes or parole purposes a violent crime.
The thing about domestic violence is that it doesn't start with a homicide. It starts small and it escalates over time.
That single change to Louisiana law will keep serial domestic abusers in prison longer, likely saving lives.
Part of why our homicide rate is so high in Louisiana is that we fail to hold offenders accountable for those early instances of domestic batteries, and therefore it's escalating to a homicide before we hold them accountable for it.
When you look at the fact that we've got folks out there who are obviously vulnerable, who are abused, who are taken advantage of, we need to make sure that we're in a position to be able to effectively protect those folks under all circumstances, and that's what this bill seeks to do.
While Glover's legislative fix and another bill pre-filed by Smith would provide that protection,
In favor of final passage, vote yes. Those opposed, vote no.
Winiski says there's a lot of work left.
Do you think there is this lack of understanding? Lawmakers really don't know that domestic abuse battery isn't included on the crimes of violence list.
I think a lot of them don't know, or maybe weren't aware. Hopefully they are now.
But both Winiski and Glover say that awareness must come with the understanding that adding domestic abuse battery to the crimes of violence list is truly a matter of life and death.
We have got to get to a point in Louisiana where we are taking domestic violence seriously. And until we get to that point, we're going to continue to see homicide rates that are astronomical in our state.
That's Stacey Cameron reporting. The new legislative session gets underway Monday, and those bills will make their way through committee and debate. Stacey plans to travel back to Baton Rouge. Keep us all updated on the progress of this important domestic abuse issue. Well, it began with a series of KSLA investigations called A Crime of Violence. Now the work of Chief Investigative Reporter Stacey Cameron is helping change Louisiana law and save future lives. Stacey's reporting exposed a loophole in state law. Inmates with multiple convictions of domestic abuse, battery, who hit, kicked, even strangled their estranged partner multiple times, were getting out of prison early release. Well, the reason domestic abuse battery isn't on the state's crimes of violence list unless the victim was burned. When a couple of state lawmakers saw Stacey's reporting, they set out to close that loophole. Now that life-saving bill is on the verge of becoming law after passing the Louisiana House and Senate. Tomorrow, Stacey Cameron heads to Baton Rouge, where the governor could sign that law as early as tomorrow. We'll bring you updates as they happen. Well, in Louisiana, a person could hit, kick, and strangle their wife or dating partner. They could basically do anything short of seriously burning them, and they would be arrested for domestic abuse, could be multiple times, and still not be considered a violent criminal.
6 months ago, KSLA chief investigative reporter Stacey Cameron uncovered that sad truth about Louisiana law, while also exposing a loophole freeing many of those offenders from prison early. Well, tonight, in his final report in a series called A Crime of Violence, Stacey tells us Louisiana just took a major step in getting tough on domestic abuse.
On a breezy, sunny, hot spring afternoon,
It was 2 years ago that I finally ended my domestic abuse situation.
I sat with Valencia Jones, a domestic abuse survivor
It started with emotional and verbal, and then it went to physical.
who now works as a therapist with the domestic violence group at the Samaritan Counseling Center in Shreveport.
It meant everything to me for this to become my mission because I made it out. So I want to reach back and give a helping hand to other women who want to get out as well.
Like many domestic violence advocates across Louisiana, Jones is praising the passage of House Bill 896, classifying domestic abuse battery as a violent crime.
Unless you've lived it or if you looked in someone's eyes and seen the fear, then you wouldn't understand just how much this new law means to us.
The new law is meaningful, Jones says, because people convicted of beating their wives, dating partners, or loved ones will now face stiffer penalties, no longer getting out of prison early.
With tougher laws, women would feel safe. They wouldn't need to actually leave the state or become homeless or go in hiding.
It's very, very important that we do everything that we can to protect our children and our families from domestic abuse.
Representatives Patricia Smith of Baton Rouge and Cedric Glover from Shreveport
Well, it's an outstanding team effort.
orchestrated HB 896 to passage at the state capitol, a process Glover says started last fall.
I have to first of all thank you all at KSLA for bringing this to my attention and giving me an opportunity to be able to try and close some loopholes.
In a series of investigative reports, Louisiana law needs to be changed to fully cover domestic abuse battery as a crime of violence. I exposed a legal loophole. People convicted of attacking and physically injuring a loved one multiple times
Hit them, kick them, slap them.
were getting out of prison quicker than other violent offenders and facing softer probation requirements because domestic abuse battery didn't fall on the state's crimes of violence list.
You've got purse snatching on that list. You've got carjacking on that list. And yet you can strangle your wife and not be included on that list.
But after lobbying Capitol colleagues on their own for months,
It was a struggle, but we got to it.
Smith and Glover joined legislative efforts,
As opposed to the shotgun approach of two bills.
passing a law making domestic abuse battery a violent crime, a move Jones believes will save lives because under the old law,
It was not only absurd, it was actually dangerous.
she says domestic abusers often went free from jail before survivors could find safety and support from a place like Samaritan.
We have women who come to us and say, I've been dealing with this 30 years, but I don't have time to leave. 'Cause by the time I try to gather my resources or secure a place for me and my children, he's home.
Hoping the new law turns that problem into a thing of the past, Jones says much work is still needed to end domestic violence in Louisiana.
But one meeting at a time, one woman at a time, one news story at a time, it all helps.
For KSLA 12 News, I'm Chief Investigative Reporter Stacey Cameron.
HB 896, the bill on domestic violence and protecting the survivors of abuse, unanimously passed the House and State Senate and now sits on Governor John Bel Edwards' desk, waiting his signature to become law.
New at 10, signed, sealed, and delivered this afternoon. Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards put his signature to House Bill 896. It's a tough new domestic violence law that many say will save lives here in Louisiana. You may recall the push to pass that legislation came following a series of KSLA investigative reports. Back in the fall, Chief Investigative Reporter Stacey Cameron exposed a loophole in Louisiana law. The loophole freed some serial domestic abusers from prison early. The reason? People convicted of domestic abuse weren't considered violent criminals unless they burned their victims. Now, thanks to bipartisan cooperation in the State House and Senate, that loophole is now a thing of the past. Now, anyone convicted of seriously injuring a loved one or domestic partner will serve serious prison time. That felony cannot be expunged from their record, And strict probation requirements will now be placed on these abusers after getting out.